The textiles of the Merovingian period from the 5th to the 8th century Europe are a rich blend of textiles from the Germanic to the Roman to the Asian traditions. Let's take a closer look at the fabrics that these fascinating people spun, wove, and wore. Welcome to Suvia's Letters, where I share videos on the late antique and early medieval periods dealing with clothing, textiles, domestic economies, botany, agronomy, gardening, cooking, or just anything else that really strikes my fancy. Today I'm sharing a brief overview of the textiles that have been found in the Merovingian graves. We will look at the fibers they spun and the dyes they used to make colorful clothing. The reality of the clothing of the past is not the drab gray, sad stuff you see in movies. Rather, creativity and inventiveness provided a rich rainbow of colors, textures, and patterns to choose from. So let's look at the textiles available to the Merovingian people. For most people, their only exposure to anything Merovingian is the character from the Matrix movie and the very eldritch and fancy neckwear that the character wore. But so much fantastical lore is wrapped up in the whole bloodline of Christ thing, which makes for great entertainment, but not so much with rigorous academic research. So let's just drag ourselves back to reality. The Merovingian culture from the late 5th to the late 8th century northern Gaul is named after a semi-mythical ruler, Merovech. Very little is known about the early years of this kingdom, said to be founded by Clovis, who ruled from 482 to 511 of the Common Era. The Merovingians held sway over what is now Belgium, northern France, and the Rhineland over to the Loire and east across the Rhine. Recent research goes beyond the semi-mythology of nebulous beginnings to shine a light on a rich, multi-ethnic society. The Merovingians were the inheritors of the sub-Roman world, and they wove a new vibrant culture with ties across the Western Isles of Britain, Northern Europe, and east past the Mediterranean centers to Byzantium and beyond. Clothing, bedding, draperies, pillows, floor coverings, wall coverings, and other uses all needed a steady supply of labor-intensive textile products. There was no online, late-night, drunken fabric shopping. Or is that just me? During the medieval times, there were several main sources for textiles. There was home textile production for household use. The production of textiles took up a large part of domestic economies in the early medieval period. Raising fiber crops and animals, harvesting, spinning, and weaving provided textiles for household use, often made up a large portion of daily activities of the women of the household. There is also home textile production for trade. When a household had a surplus of textiles, they could be used for trade or exchange, and time spent on producing a surplus was more ad hoc than true specialist production. There was also larger industrial production. During Roman times, large farms and villas in Gaul provided fabric for the Roman market. By the 6th century, the remnants of Roman industrial capabilities had shrunk significantly. Some regions continued to produce textiles for trade and export. This production was done by full-time specialists and craftspeople, and the products were usually of a higher quality than domestic production because of the specialization. The textile specialists could be attached to a patron or a workshop. Oftentimes, these specialists were tied to this workshop or were slaves. There was also trade and importation. Trade networks ranged as far east as China, and Byzantium was a major source of luxury textiles used by the wealthy and the elite. The Byzantine emperors maintained a close control of silk production, and fabrics and clothing were exchanged among royal elites as gifts and as patronage. The dress of Merovingian women evolved over time from two different cultures, the later Roman and the Germanic traditions of the migration era. As the period ended, women's dress became more similar to the prevailing Byzantine style and could be seen in a lot of the Carolingian manuscript illustrations and frescoes of the time. The clothes worn by women in the 5th and 6th century were basically an underdress and maybe an overdress, and a front-closing coat fastened with brooches. The size, shape, and location of the brooches was often a regional fashion. We don't have very many whole garments from this period. We do have a small collection that are housed at the Shell's Museum right outside of Paris. But for the most part, our knowledge of what Merovingian women wore is very conjectural, and most of our evidence comes from fragments of textiles that have survived, often in graves and similar environments. There are 3 main fibers used in Merovingian textiles: wool, linen, and silk. Sheep's wool was probably one of the most common textiles used in Merovingian society. And modern sheep are very different from the sheep breeds available in the early medieval period. It would be several centuries before the modern breeds we are familiar with emerged. At the time of the Merovingian culture, there were 2 main types of sheep available. One is an Iron Age sheep of a short-tailed variety, often similar to the Soay type of sheep, which is a small brown sheep with medium fine wool fleeces. The wool from these sheep had a natural pigmentation that ranged from brown to gray to light tan. And these older sheep varieties had a double coat containing both fine and coarse hairs. Fleeces were plucked or hand-pulled, and the sheep naturally shed seasonally, and the wool could also be gathered from the environment. There was also a Roman breed of sheep that was available at this time. They were white in color, and they had a true fine wool or were a generalized medium fine wool. These sheep produced a fabric that could be easily dyed to a range of vibrant colors using plant and animal type dyes. Shearing became more common in this era, and the Romans introduced the practice of putting blankets on sheep to protect the wool. Quality and quantity of wool fabric was enough that it did not have to be imported into the Merovingian regions. It's possible that very fine woolen textiles could have been imported from specialist workshops from elsewhere around the Mediterranean. Silk was imported along trade routes, and evidence for very early silk fibers in Europe suggested trade routes reaching into China. China had the monopoly on silk manufacture until around the 2nd century of the Common Era. By the 5th century, it had arrived in the Middle East, and in the 6th century, Justinian acquired the technology to produce silk, and Byzantium was enriched by the Western monopoly of silk. Silk was sometimes blended with other fibers such as linen and wool. In these textiles, the warp could be of silk and the weft of another fiber, or it could be the other way around. These textiles were costly and very rare. Royal gift exchanges among heads of state or church leaders helped to cement relationships and foster patronage. Silk was so costly and rare that it was only the elites who had access to it. An example of the silks could be seen in the sleeve cuffs of Arnagon's late 6th century coat found at the Saint Denis Cathedral. This textile probably came from Byzantine workshops, possibly as a gift exchange. The red silk samite was embroidered with gold threads in a band of bees and flowers and rondelles. The coat itself was made of a purple tabby woven of silk and bast fiber, probably linen. The different fibers would have given the textile a luster and faint iridescence. Linen is one of the oldest fibers in use. The name of linen, the translation of linum usitatissimum, is linen most useful. It can be grown for fiber or for oil, and the seeds can be used in cooking. Flaxseed oil or linseed oil has industrial uses and is also used in oil painting. Some of the earliest evidence of linen use comes from 34,000 years ago in the Republic of Georgia. A study of ancient pollen led to the discovery of microscopic linen fibers that showed evidence of being dyed. Archaeological and textual evidence shows that about 10,000 BCE, linen use was widespread around the Mediterranean basin and further north and east. Finds in Swiss lakes date back to 10,000 years before the Common Era, and the Neolithic and Mesolithic cultures created textiles with surprising complexity and colors. During the Roman era, the best linens came from Egypt. However, there were centers of linen textile production in Gaul that continued into the early medieval period. Charlemagne, in 789, decreed that all households must cultivate flax and weave their own linen. There were other bast fibers available, such as hemp, and these are often hard to distinguish in an archaeological setting between hemp and linen. Textile colors come from the process of dyeing the fabric. Most fibers were naturally off-white to tan to dark browns, and to get true colors, sometimes the fabric was bleached before dyeing. Fabric was used also in the natural colors. Most people would have used dyes locally available to them, creating regional color schemes. Wealthy and powerful people could purchase fabrics with more expensive imported dyestuffs. The process for dyeing fabrics using natural dyes starts with a process called mordanting. The fabric is treated with metal salts such as alum, which bind to the fibers. The dyes then bind themselves to the mordant. Dyeing fabric is a messy and often smelly endeavor, as some dyes needed to be set with ammonia made from stale urine. It also requires a lot of water, so it was often near rivers or lakes. The darker, richer colors come from the first dye bath, or the fabric could be put through several dye baths to deepen the color. As additional fabric is dyed in the same solution, the colors get lighter and weaker. These lighter colored fabrics were often much less expensive and were more accessible to the common people. So don't let Hollywood fool you. Ancient people loved color in their clothing as much as modern people do. So what kind of colors were available to the Merovingian people in their textiles? Starting with red, we could get a wide range of colors from pale pink to a deep, rich, nearly black red. Some of the plants that could be attained locally to create red were dyer's madder, wild madder, dyer's woodruff, and bedstraw. Additional reds could be obtained through the importation of dyes from the East. There was also kermes and also Polish cochineal, which were created from grinding up insects to get the red color. When it comes to obtaining a blue fabric color, woad was almost the exclusive dye used by the Merovingian cultures, or available to the Merovingian cultures. Indigo had not yet been introduced into Europe. Woad is not mordanted, but it needs to be fermented. When the fabric is taken from the dye bath, it is a yellow-green, but quickly turns blue as it reacts with the oxygen in the air. Yellows could be obtained by a number of different locally available plants. Weld, dyer's bloom, and onion skins all produce various colors of yellow. When it comes to purple, there were several different dyes available to the Merovingian peoples. The first was the importation of the Tyrian purple fabric or dyes. This comes from the Murex snail, and it's extremely expensive, and so the fabric would have been a status symbol. Arnigan's coat had purple dyed threads, which may have been dyed using Tyrian purple. There were also a couple of other lichens that were more locally available that could also produce a purple color. When it comes to brown, oftentimes some of these natural fibers came with a natural brown coloring, especially in some of the older wool breeds. And so the natural color of the fiber would just be retained. If you wanted to dye a fabric brown, you could use walnut shells or oak tannin. To obtain a green color, yellow is overdyed with blue. And so you could obtain a wide range of greens using different levels and concentrations of both yellow and blue dyes. Looms are used to control the warp and weft of the fabrics as it is being woven. During most of the Merovingian period, weaving technologies were fairly simple. Upright beams held horizontal bars to which the warp was attached, and the design of the textiles could be controlled by the use of heddles, or additional horizontal bars with strings attached to the warp threads. These heddles can be lifted and lowered between the rows of warp threads, creating a variety of textile patterns. The most common type of loom in the Merovingian area was a warp-weighted loom, and these types of looms have been found as far back in time as 7000 BC in the Middle East. The loom consists of two vertical uprights, a horizontal warp beam, a shed rod, a heddle rod, and weights. The warp threads are tied to the horizontal beam at the top and hang vertically down towards the ground, ending in a heavy weight to keep the warp threads taut. The warp-weighted loom is suitable for weaving long cloths, as the fabric could be rolled up as the weavers worked. If the fabric was wider than a meter, weaving required two people, and the weavers would pass the shuttle back and forth. Another type of loom that was used during this time period was called the upright two-beam loom. This would have a rigid horizontal beam at the top and a rigid horizontal beam at the bottom, and the warp threads would be strung between these two beams. This type of loom was used by the Romans to weave large tube textiles, but the length of the fabric is limited by the height of the loom. This type of loom was not as common as the warp-weighted loom in the Merovingian kingdoms. Weavers could sit as they wove from the bottom to the top of the loom. When it comes to types of fabrics that were available to the Merovingian peoples, we can look at the different types of weave structures. Woven textiles, at their most basic, are two systems of threads running perpendicular to each other, and it's the interlacing of these threads that creates a joined structure that is flexible. By far the most common textile used in the Merovingian kingdoms was the tabby or plain weave fabric, and this fabric could be in silk, wool, or linen. This is the most basic weave structure with a single weft thread interlacing with a single warp thread. A balanced tabby will have the same number of threads in the warp and weft. Basket weaved fabric is a variation on tabby with two weft threads passing over and under two warp threads. Rep effect tabby, or ripsmata, is another type of fabric that was available to the Merovingian peoples. In this fabric, the thread count is higher in one system than the other, and weft threads often alternate between thick and thin thread to give a ribbed look to the fabric. Warp threads are so tightly woven that you can't see the weft threads, so this makes it a warp-faced textile. Variations on this fabric are what is modernly known as ottoman, and these are similar to rep effect tabbies. This has a horizontal ribbed weave created with the filler yarn used to produce a more prominent rib. Twill fabrics are probably the second most common type of fabric after the tabby. This is where one system passes over multiple threads of the other system. You are probably familiar with a common modern twill fabric, denim. This is a warp-faced fabric. The diagonal lines are made by the weft passing under two or more warp threads, making a ribbed pattern. Variations of twills were very common at this time period and created a wide variety of different types of fabric. One type of twill fabric is called a rippin copper or a barred damask. This is a rep twill, usually a 2/1 twill. Alternate bands of warp-faced twill with bands of weft-faced twill, usually after every pick, creates a ribbed effect in the textile. In Merovingian kingdoms, rippin copper or this barred damask was most often made in linen, and there are early examples from Roman sites in Egypt. Rippon copper or barred damask was considered a luxury textile in early medieval Europe. Another type of twill fabric that you are probably familiar with is the herringbone or the chevron twill. Herringbone is a broken twill weave composed of vertical sections of diagonal lines that are alternately right hand and left hand in direction and creating sort of a fishbone pattern. Herringbone fabrics have been found in the Bronze and early Iron Age Hallstatt area dating from about 8 to 700 before the Common Era. Another type of twill was the lozenge or diamond twill. This is created by alternating the warp and weft to create a distinctive diamond or lozenge-shaped pattern. You can use different colors of thread for the warp and weft fabric, making a very pretty fabric. And this type of fabric is very popular among modern reenactors in both linen and wool. While a common fabric in an early medieval period, it was not known in pre-Roman Europe. A variation on the diamond twill is a broken diamond twill. This is created with the warp and weft systems being offset by one thread. Cross twill or kruskropper is a type of broken twill. It's a woven pattern of 2-point twills running in different directions, together forming rows in the fabric in the shape of a cross. Other specialty fabric can be created by using the directional twist of plied yarns or single spun yarns to create the pattern and design of the textile. The yarn used in spin patterned fabric is often hard spun with a twist angle of at least 50%. And the most common direction in Northern Europe at the time was Z-twist. The S-twist yarn would have been imported or made especially for this textile. You can create a dimensional effect by using a plied yarn that is thicker than the single thread in the other direction. Sometimes an additional thread was inserted into the weft to create a more dimensional effect. Usually the spin patterned fabrics were a tabby weave in order to really highlight the decoration created by the different spin direction in the yarns being used to weave the fabric. Spin patterned textiles were considered a luxury textile as it took experienced spinners and weavers to produce. The yarn needs to be very tightly and evenly plied, and once the fabric has been removed from the loom, the linen is wetted to swell the fibers. Then the fabric is flattened by glass smoothers or rollers. Another luxury fabric that was available to the Merovingians was a Samite. Samite is a weft-faced compound twill. It could be plain or figured, meaning patterned, in which the warp threads are hidden on both sides of the fabric by the floats of the ground and patterning weft with only the binding warps visible. Samites from Persian and Byzantine workshops and were often highly figured with intricate designs. These were most often available in silk and would have been extremely expensive and only available to the elites of the society. Another type of fabric that could be created are three-dimensional textiles with a linear design. These pleated or plissé textiles have been shaped by heat, are usually a tabby weave, and in woolens in a tightly spun yarn. These can also be created by using different types of weaves, different types of fibers, and different fibers of different size. I know this video has been brief-ish, but I hope you found it interesting. I am endlessly fascinated by the ingenuity of the human race to take bits of things and make very pretty and useful things. I am indebted to the amazing researchers like Antoinette Rast-Eicher, Penelope Walton, Patrick Perrin, and the many, many others working in this field. It is through their hard work that we have any understanding of the textiles of this era. Modern archaeology has come a long way from the bad old days when the scraps of textiles were cleaned away as detritus from the precious metal. Man, that just hurts my heart. I will link to my Merovingian playlist so that you can watch the other videos that I've made on this topic. And if you feel like supporting this channel, there are several ways to do that in the description below. You can also help spread the Merovingian love by liking, subscribing, and sharing the dickens out of this video. I would be deeply grateful.